Ready? All right. Welcome everyone to the Design Review Board meeting of May 23rd, 2023. If we could have a roll call, Carrie.
Thank you. Chair Langberg,
Here.
Vice Chair Henley. Here. Board Member Bush.
Here.
Board Member Deedler.
Here.
Board Member Level.
Here.
All right. Marshall Velth, our alternate, is not in attendance today.
Okay, thank you. We do have some minutes to approve from the meeting of December 21st. Test. So we have some minutes to approve from our meeting of December 21st. Does anybody have any comments on the minutes or questions? Could I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Yeah, I'll make the motion to approve the minutes as written.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion?
No.
No discussion, Lynn? No?
Yeah, I can barely hear you, and I'm not sure what minutes you were referring to.
With a minute. Okay, well, we'll start over then. Minutes of December 21st, meeting of December 21st, which you were not part of that meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So we were talking about the Kathy Austin project over on Healdsburg was the main item and a sign exemption. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right. So I guess we can stick to our motion and our second. Can we call a vote?
Sure. Chair Langberg,
Aye.
Vice Chair Henley.
Aye.
Is it okay if I just call you by your names instead of the board members? It's a tongueful for me. Thank you. Carrie Bush.
Sure. Yeah. Aye.
Christine Level.
Abstain. I
Abstain.
wasn't here.
Sure. And Lynn Deedler.
Abstain.
Okay, the motion passes 3-0 with 2 abstentions from board members Deedler and Level.
All right. Thank you. And our next item is any planning department update?
Yes, so a few updates going on. I think the the biggest one that's been in the paper is the budget discussions that the city council is having. From the planning department perspective, we have had to make a number of reductions, just as every department has. I've been through a number of discussions with the budget subcommittee. They just completed their recommendations and discussions yesterday. It will now be moving on to the full council discussions. But their recommendations did have a couple of impacts that you'll see. The main one probably being that the facade improvement grant, we were looking at potentially expanding that from 20,000 to 25,000. When I was asked to do the initial round of budget reductions, 10% for each department, I did reduce that back to 20. But with the
Carrie,
yes,
could you speak closer to your mic?
a little closer, I think. Is that better? Okay.
Much better.
Thank you. It used to be about 6 inches, so I feel like I'm going to touch it. So in the discussions with the budget subcommittee, they did reduce the facade grant improvement grant to $10,000. So it'll be limited. They were looking, generally at discretionary items because there aren't that many discretionary items in our budget. The Climate Action Committee had a few asks that were also eliminated. And the facade improvement grant, even though it's been really successful, it will just be more competitive next year because it will be more limited in funding. And so that recommendation is going to the full council. They'll start their hearings in June, I believe. So, and beyond that, Planner John Jay will be back at your next meeting. So I'm sort of the substitute teacher. And I think the other component that I did want to remind people of, however, was the ethics training that you should all have gotten a reminder of. If any of you have completed that, could you just raise your hand so I can knock you off my list? All right. Okay. Thank you. And for the others, if you are having problems logging in, because I know a few other of my board members did, if you email Carrie Vasquez, she's the person who sent out the friendly reminder. She will be able to assist with getting you, helping with login information or any of that stuff. So she's been really
Carrie,
helpful.
Can you
Yeah.
provide some background on where this requirement came from?
Sure.
I mean, as a licensed professional, I do a lot of continuing education and have ethics requirements as well. It seems very duplicative and I'll just say onerous.
Sure. So this was actually a city council discussion and directive that now they have to undergo this as do all city staff. They discussed and decided that they wanted all of their board members who are making decisions on behalf of the city to also have or interacting with city staff of various levels, not just me, but all the way down to admin assistants and whatnot, to have that training. And so that was a city council decision. It isn't required by the state for these boards and commissions. It is for council and for staff. They decided they wanted everyone to be covered with it.
That's who will take up our
There
pain
you go.
points with.
There you go. Okay, so that is that. And yeah, if some of you, like, I know I actually have ethics and other stuff trainings and this forum stuff for other boards that I serve on for the city. I still have to do that as well, but it may be just a discussion or a comment to city council. I would suggest, like, if you already have some other relevant additional training, that could count towards that or something like that. I don't.
I have a question regarding,
Sure.
I will try to speak close to the. So, we haven't been given any guidance on this ethics training about how long it's going to take. Like, once you get into it, like what's involved when you get into it, you got to log in, you got to do some sort of process with some multinational corporation where you're logging into their program, and then what happens?
Sorry, so it is a 2-hour training. You cannot fast forward through it. You do actually, or if you only take an hour to do it, and it's supposed to be 2 hours, you basically will be given an additional class. So do it at the pace that you sort of like driver's ed to get points off your record. You can't speed through it. You got to do a certain pace. But you get and actually the city gets automatically notified when you've completed that training with the system that we have. It's basically ethics about decision making, and I mean, there's a lot of like the FPPC types of things.
What's
fair,
FPPC?
it's the California's Fair Political Practice Act. So not taking bribes for decision making, not meeting and deciding things behind closed doors, that kind of stuff is covered by the training.
So
And
what do you do? It gives you a page online, and then you have to stay on that page for a certain amount of time, and then you move.
It's an online course, so you read the
I mean, do you
material, and
take
if you read,
quizzes, or do you what do you do exactly? Like on the driver's thing, if you get that, you got to take a little quiz.
yeah, it's very, very similar. It's basically the same format. They have scenarios, they have explanations of the laws, and then they have scenarios, and then they have quizzes with some of those sort of scenarios. What would you do? What applies? Or, what falls under this law, this, or this type of thing. So it's very similar to that kind of a
Okay,
class.
so in AB 1, 2, 3, 4, it's expressly says that if you're not paid anything, you're not required to take this. So
Correct. But our city council has requested that all board members take it.
I mean, it's just more time to spend doing free stuff when there's this stuff.
Yes.
Harry, I tried to log in and it asks for a passcode.
Okay, so I'm gonna have you contact Carrie Vasquez directly. She's the person who sent the email reminder to you.
Wait, I cannot quite hear you.
So Carrie Vasquez, the admin services person who sent you the reminder email, you should reply to that and let her know that you're having problems. And she's the person who manages that system and can help you with that.
Okay.
Okay, and then I think the other piece of planning news, and then we should probably head into the rest of the agenda, is that we did do interviews for a planning technician full-time, and we did extend an offer, and she has accepted. So she's working through that process, and hopefully we'll have her on board by July, beginning of July, or a little bit earlier. So
Right.
yeah. In the meantime, we do have Elise Monday, Tuesday, and Nico Wednesday, Thursdays, should you need assistance.
All right, thank you. So with the facade improvement grants, will we reduce the max number per grant, or has that been talked about, or?
They did not discuss that. Again, this is not, at this point, it's just a proposal to the full council. But I think if this group wanted to agendize that for your next meeting to discuss any recommendations, I will say that it used to be 50-50 split match. It is now a 75% city, 25% match up to 2,500. That has certainly gained in popularity. We've also been, and the relaunch folks advertised it much, much better than we could alone as a department. So that was really helpful. And I think we also changed the requirements to make it less onerous for a landlord to sign on to the program. I wouldn't recommend changing that for sure, but if there's, if you'd like to discuss, and you can just take a consensus now if you'd like, if it remains at the 10K, if you want to propose adjusting that to council, it's a pretty easy item if it's, but we could put that on your next agenda to discuss if you'd like.
I think we should do that. We should probably get some additional design review guidelines for it. If it's going to become more competitive, it's probably not, replacing a front door in a back alley kind of a thing.
Right. And I do know there was definitely a, focus, even though it's anyone in town, but the focus of the budget committee in some of the discussions was on downtown. So certainly, I know in the past Spirit Works and in the Barlow, which had a pretty nice building and they enhanced it with some paint. Is that something that would be, where would the council like you to focus it? I think is absolutely valid.
The storefront door at Coach's Corner comes to mind as, not enhancing our downtown in any way by replacing that. Right. So we could put a little more thought into that. Or if we have $2,000 grants instead of $4 $2,500 grants as a, simple shift.
Right. Okay. So we'll definitely agendize that at your next meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions for staff on those
Yes, I have
items?
a question.
Go for it.
So can you give us an update on the Woodmark project construction and the hotel project?
Absolutely. So Woodmark, we have issued building permits. I'm not exactly sure when they're going to start, but they do have everything done. We had a big pre-construction meeting with all the relevant departments, engineering, building, planning, arborist, out on site, and the Grant and Renteria tribe for tribal monitoring, and all of their folks. So they know what they need to do, and they are all set to go. I don't know. The last I talked to them, it sounded like they are mobilized. They have I was just by the site yesterday. They have the erosion control, everything staged that they need to. I think they're probably dealing with closing the loans and stuff on their side. But they are anticipating imminent construction. So in the next week or two, I would imagine. The Hotel Sebastopol, they are waiting for some approvals on their archaeology plan still. In the meantime, they have submitted their Caltrans encroachment permit, which is a pretty big package, as you know. If you've ever had to do a Caltrans encroachment permit for full sidewalk improvement, curb gutter, crosswalks. We are looking at having them do the mid-block crossing. It's actually not a mid-block. It is the Weeks Way crosswalk. Weeks Way is a valid city right away. So it's not really mid-block. It's just at Weeks Way. With the intent of then, because it's Caltrans has identified as a safety issue, eliminating the crosswalk at Screaming Mimi's. There's some redesign on that so that people would just be using the one that's at Highway 12, Sebastopol Avenue, and not have that double crosswalk right there. That's pretty dangerous. And some of that includes, extending the curb from the hotel on Depot Street down, so it leads you very much directly across the street, and that and it's a more natural transition than currently. So they have submitted that whole package to Caltrans. They are working with us to get their PG&E requirement stuff in. As everyone knows, PG&E is one of the hugely long lead times in terms of development. They also have a little bit of a complicated site because they have electrical crossing a public right of way. It sounds like we will actually be merging those two parcels, the parking lot parcel and the hotel parcel, which from a city perspective, I mean, I've certainly seen rights of way across one parcel before it happens. It's just not typical. But there's nothing, it actually frankly makes it easier because they can't go and sell the parking lot parcel away to somebody else. So they're working on a lot of the technical stuff they can to keep that project moving until they can actually break ground with the archaeology, followed by the construction. There's the long, detailed explanation on that one.
It's amazing how much is involved.
It's a huge amount, and unfortunately, they have their engineers working away on the Caltrans stuff as well. So they're definitely committed to the project. You don't do that for fun.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, let's keep moving then. Are there any comments from the public on items that are not on the agenda? Please come up to the podium. You can tell us your name and
Hello, can you hear me? Good. My name is Glenn Pino. I live on Healdsburg Avenue, catty corner from the project on Murphy and Healdsburg Avenue. Okay. I've addressed the planning, the design review board. I was at the Zoom meeting on the 23rd of December, which those minutes, but last meeting was, there was some reason you didn't get together, but the planning commission did, and they approved the conversion of the 2 lower units to residential, and that's been green lighted for that. And Carrie might correct me, but I don't think there's any required conditions that that go along with that per se. There may be, but I'm here to kind of update you all from my perspective and the neighborhood's perspective, because I don't speak for the neighbors, but I've talked to the neighbors. And the extent that the conversion has been approved, my contention and the neighbors' contention was there was an extraordinary number of exterior lights that are unshielded and seem from a perspective of a residential perspective overkill. So we brought the concern to the planning commission. We were very well received, and Kathy Austin was there on Zoom. According to my recollection, she's no longer the architect involved in that project. She's got the other project, but she was going to relay information to the builder owner with regard to our concern. And all of that was really, I thought that was a very receptive proposition. So I did meet with the superintendent of the building, and he asked me my concerns, and I addressed that just so you know, and this is really why I'm here, and I may run a few minutes, but I'm trying to keep it succinct, so I'm trying to compress this, believe me. I think I counted 14 exterior lights, unshielded, bulbs with on the side of the building, a white building, when they've been on 24/7 since they've gotten this, they don't have any timers on them. And they're not really aware of how blatant that can be to me and the people around us. So I'll just use this caveat to say, please go, if you're in Sebastopol, go by the building at night and see for yourself what's happening. The two brightest ones, I asked him, he said, which ones concern you? I said, well, those two bright ones that are on the side of the building are redundant. Why don't you take those down? And I think we'll see how it goes. He did that, but it sort of toned it down, but there has been no effort to shield the lights or down. There is no night sky adoption policy. I don't know if you have, or you should consider it, but it really feels like a commercial building. And from that perspective, I don't want to be the policeman. I don't want to keep saying, remove all but just the entry light and put everything else on motion sensor. Because realistically, if it's going to be converted into a residential, you don't need security lights like this on 24/7. It's not truly, it wasn't designed as an apartment building. It wasn't, maybe the upstairs are apartments, but whoever designed it didn't take in enough consideration of the lighting. And it really is glaring. So I'm asking you to take a look at this and to consider this in the approval of the next project and in future conversion projects, or even in just the ones that are, close to the highway.
And sir, your 3 minutes are up. So if you
Okay,
could wrap up,
I'll
that'd be great.
Okay, I promise. I really will. So I don't know where I go from here, but the one thing I do want to say to the design review board, and this is kind of a, this is what happens when we allow commercial buildings to get, retroed into residential. It could have been set back, could have been a whole different design from the very get-go if people knew that this was the course that they were going. Now, and I'll just leave it here, and I promise I'll keep it in less than a minute. This new proposal to convert the units that Kathy Austin brought forward to the committee is to take that commercial building that she designed, and they've set it back to plan, and then try to make a better building out of it. But I think you should just reject that plan and look at it from a strictly residential community, and consider this impact of what these builders are getting away with. Because personally, I don't think they really care. They don't seem to have enough consideration. Okay, that was my comment.
Thank you, Glenn. Thanks for your comment. So moving along.
Chair Langberg, would you like me
Yes.
to give a little background on that? Actually, I want to make sure that you have my card, sir, because I'm actually the person who can help follow up on that. So this project was approved to be 100% residential by the Planning Commission. Kathy Austin was there, and what happened was the person who so she designed the building initially when it came to the design review board for approval. The property was then sold to a new owner who did not engage her during the construction process, and he added a bunch of lights. The Planning Commission actually put a condition of approval. It does not need to come back to design review because it's all interior work. So it did require a use permit for 100% residential in a commercial corridor. However, they did put a condition on the project that they need to fix the lighting basically and submit a plan for staff approval. I am a huge advocate of dark sky. So we will definitely make sure that those are those are corrected and a number of those will be taken down. I will say that if the lights are still not being turned off, that's helpful for me to know because I can communicate with the architect. She's working with the new owner who owns both of those sites. And so, yes, absolutely. I can make sure that we get on that to turn those lights off at certain times and things like that, because that's inappropriate. We do have in our general plan a dark sky policy and generally in our standard DRB conditions of approval for any project. So this is out of compliance with that. And so it's kind of almost a code enforcement issue where they need to turn those lights off. Yes, they will ultimately get fixed. It won't be coming to this board, but it will be coming to the planning department so that we can review it and make sure we approve that. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay, so we'll move on to our regular agenda. Our item of the ODS update, the objective design standards, which is process moving through the city. Christine and I are on subcommittee with Paul Fritz reviewing all those, and Carrie will give us a little background.
Yeah, and
on
Chair
where
Lambert,
we
do you
are.
want me to give you the initial kind of background on the law stuff first?
Sure.
Okay. So, and I do have a brief presentation. It's, I will say, slightly out of date, just because there have been a couple of new laws adopted since this, but I wanted to provide a context of why we're doing this process. This is in response to two state laws. The objective design standards are in response to a state law called SB 35, Senate Bill 35, that was passed a few years ago, which basically says that certain projects of affordable housing can opt to go through a ministerial process instead of coming to the design review board. In that, they still have to meet any objective standards and objective design standards. So anything in our municipal code that is objective, i.e. it's not a matter of discretion, it's either a yes or a no, you meet or you don't meet. If it's discretionary, which is what basically all of our current design guidelines from 2010 are, we cannot utilize those. So when the Woodmark project, the 7716-7760 Bodega came before, they initially started out in the design review process, had a couple of preliminary reviews. They submitted to go through the design review process, but then they withdrew it and submitted under that law. We lost the ability to have our design guidelines applied to the project. We still had our zoning ordinance, our subdivision ordinance, our curb gutter sidewalk, everything in our muni code in terms of frontage improvements, all that kind of stuff still applied. But this project is basically to create objective design standards that we can use for those projects. The second component of it is so this is basically the context. What you have today is the existing conditions analysis that the consultant did. And the design review board is now going through the actual admin, not yet public draft of what the design standards will be. And it's twice as thick as the existing conditions, as you can see. The consultant is also in between when I got the grant to fund this project and when we put out the RFP, the state passed a bill called SB 9, which is a single family lot split bill. And it basically, we can adopt standards and requirements for that, but it's kind of the same thing. If you don't have anything in place, a single family property can be split and must be allowed to be split to accommodate at least 2 800 square foot single family dwelling units. And there's a lot of other stuff in there about what you can and can't do. And so the consultant is also doing standards for that for us. Those will be, we're getting through the objective standards first, and then we'll be going through the SB 9. And actually, I can go through the law, but we can actually just talk about the objective design standards before I go into the context law if you'd like.
Just
which
go
goes
right-
over a lot of other laws too, but it's probably good background for the committee.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Okay, so this is actually, for those of you who were on the board a couple of years ago, and let me just see if I can get this. There we go. We did have a joint planning commission design review board meeting where this presentation was given. So like I said, this is a couple of years old, but all of these laws are still in place to talk about, and it was kind of right before we started the objective, that design subcommittee. And so I just wanted to give you guys the background on this so that you knew what was going on with state law and how it applies to the design review board. So as if most of you are alive and reading the paper, you know that the state is dealing with a lot of housing issues. The state legislature has adopted numerous laws probably since 2017. They were a little quiet during COVID, but there's another new lump of potential bills this year. Now that people are outside of the COVID emergency and back to sort of the more normal stuff. Some of the laws do limit local control, like the SB 35, and I'll go into when that does apply and doesn't for Sebastopol, as well as a bunch of other stuff. The overarching bill is actually not a bill, it's an act. It's called the Housing Accountability Act. And what it basically does is it's grown in importance in recent years as it's kind of been modified to include things like the SB 35 and those types of things. It does limit the type of project and when and how a city could potentially deny or require changes to a project. So for instance, a jurisdiction cannot disprove or deny a housing project at a lower density if it complies with the objective standards in place at the time the application is deemed complete. So again, objective design standards, that's the document we're working on right now. And, you know, specifically, we do have zoning and density limits in our town. There is also a state density bonus law, which is if you have a certain percentage of affordable units, then you can actually go beyond the base zoning in a city. I will note Woodmark's zoning allowed them to build up to 87 units. They proposed 84. So they don't have any density bonus. Our zoning is, you know, along our multifamily is that intense. State law also says you cannot change that. You cannot de-densify your zoning. You can do it, but then you have to intensify it somewhere else in town and balance it all out. It's a very big balancing act. So that's kind of the main thing. There's also obviously timelines for us as a jurisdiction. I won't go into that too much. That second bullet. So what is an objective standard? An objective standard involves no personal or subjective judgment. Is it welcoming? Are you minimizing this? Are you maximizing that? Well, what is minimizing? What is maximizing? That's in the eye of the beholder. So a lot of our design guidelines say things like that. You know, minimized grading is the one I always kind of point to. At our last subcommittee meeting, we talked about putting a number to that. What does that mean in terms of cubic yards? Because otherwise we don't have any control over that or any direction and guidance to people on what's appropriate and what's not in our community. And then, you know, this will actually help those developers understand what's going to be expected. So the intent is that like everyone, the public and the property owner are all kind of, there's expectations and they're known. So yeah, things like a height limit or number of units or a setback requirement, those are definitely objective. I will say there are a lot of communities in California who are not good actors in the housing world. I mean, I've seen a number of different communities and I pay attention. Sebastopol is not one of them. And I'm actually very happy I came here to work here because of that. There are people who will say things like neighborhood character, and that really means anything but a single family house. So, you know, and if it's a multifamily zoned property, then that's just not appropriate. You can, using similar materials to surrounding buildings, you can't, however, you can see, say in objective standards, no barbed wire, no concrete block, no this, no that, or you shall use. And that's probably the biggest thing that you'll see when we release the draft for your review of the objective standards. They do not say should. They do not say may, because that has no legal impact. They say shall and will, because otherwise there's, and the intent of this is that if it's an easy site that can fall under these standards, that's great. But, you know, and I kind of think about a couple of, you know, pretty flat sites that have gone through the process one way or another, and they had no problems meeting these would have no problems meeting these standards. If it's a more difficult site and they can't meet these standards, they can still get their project approved, but they have to go through your discretionary design review board process. So it's not a no, it's a, well, I am, you know, then they would have to just go through it's a trickier site and it requires more judgment. It's probably the easiest way to explain that and how we've been talking about it as a committee. Again, you cannot require a lower density than what's allowed by your code. Unless you have a preponderance of evidence in the record, and this is where we would end up getting our outside counsel involved, because there's a specific adverse impact upon public health or safety. And so that could be, well, I mean, what that could be a range of things. Talking with folks, you know, a lot of this is subjective and it's based on case law and it's based on what the courts determine. You can have one aspect that could be approved, that could be upheld in one community and denied in another, depending on, you know, it's basically a judge's discretion on this. But, you know, I think the specific adverse impact on public health or safety is, you know, I'm not even sure what exactly that, I can't think of an example right now. I'm sorry. And there's no feasible way to mitigate what those impacts are. And so that could be a severe traffic safety or I'm not even sure what, I'm sorry, I can't think of it. It is, and I guess that's kind of the second bullet point. It's a very difficult standard to meet. I do know the city of Sausalito, I think, had something like that. And they lost that lawsuit. And so, you know, there are case law against this. If you lose that lawsuit, you get a $100,000 fine per unit for denying that project. So there's a couple of kind of administrative steps. I won't go through it hugely because it doesn't necessarily apply to you, but I think what this is about, well, what standards are we subject to? So like the objective design standards, once they are adopted, any application for housing from that date forward will be subject to them. Anything that is already in process, and this is pretty typical for any sort of zoning or design standards, you don't retroactively apply to projects that are already in your queue. That's just not fair to them. However, what the Housing Accountability Act says is that it's not the date they do their formal application, it's the date they do their preliminary review application. So like for Woodmark, it wasn't December 2020, it was October 2019 or whatever they submitted their preliminary review application. Even though they didn't, that wasn't a full submittal, but it does say, hey, once you as a city start having a conversation with a developer and talking with them about it, you can't then go as a change of rules and then retroactively apply it to them the next time they come back. So we have a preliminary application, does require less than a full complete application, but we do have those online. It does lock in standards. It also locks in The development impact fees, assuming they come back within, I think it's 180 days. So within 6 months, if they submit between their preliminary review, their last action on that and their formal application, they're on whatever development impact fees are subject that time. So like the Woodmark project, for instance, we just issued building permits for that. They're subject to the 2020, well, the pre-2021 development standards, the new development impact fees for parks and traffic impact and those types of things. They're actually on the old schedule. It's a real fun accounting practice for the planning department of when they submitted and when they, what fees apply. And they are allowed to change projects. And there's certain limitations here. It does prohibit changes to a parcel to allow, and this is that you can't reduce, okay, if people say, oh, well, Woodworks, that's too dense. We actually want to reduce our density for all R7 zoning. This law prohibits that. And you can't do it in other ways of saying, oh, well, instead of having a 35-foot height limit, we're going to have a 15-foot height limit, and which would effectively reduce the density you could do. So you can't do those kinds of back-end runarounds, loophole kind of things, and close some of those loopholes. It does prohibit a moratorium on housing development. That's not really an issue for the most part. And then the subjective design standards. So it prohibits, and this is actually kind of an important thing, it prohibits us from enforcing, or anyone for a jurisdiction from adding discretionary design guidelines like we already have after 2020. But we already have discretionary design standards, so that does not apply to us, just to be clear to everybody. That does not apply to us. And we can still modify them from what I discussed with legal counsel, as long as you're not making them hugely more onerous and you're kind of tweaking them to be consistent with what you're looking for. So we do have our discretionary standards in place. They are still valid. We are an affected city. We're a city more than 5,000 population. So that's just walking through that. Does this apply to us or not? It does also prohibit growth control ordinance. However, so that's the city of Sebastopol does have a growth management ordinance in place. We normally deal with this as a planning department or at the planning commission kind of level. You guys don't really talk about it that much. But so the Housing Crisis Act, the updates to the state law prohibit growth ordinance, control ordinances, but it does not apply if that growth management ordinance was approved before 2005 and the city or county is located in a county where at least 50% or minimum 550,000 acres is agricultural land. Sonoma County meets that requirement. We are considered an agricultural county, and our GMO was first approved in 1994, 1996. I can't remember which. So Sebastopol's growth management ordinance still stands. So when it says we're exempt, we are exempt from this portion of the law. And I will say, we have just a little bit about our growth management ordinance. So it does allow 50 units per year to be building permits to be issued. However, it does exempt a pretty big number of permits. It exempts any ADUs, any housing within the downtown core. So like the Barlow Townhomes was in the downtown core, that 18 units was not counted towards that. Affordable housing units, deed restricted affordable housing units, I should say. So like, for instance, if someone does a 4-unit development like Habitat proposed outside of downtown, now they're in downtown, so that number wouldn't count. But if they were proposing that outside of the downtown zone, we would count those unless they deed restricted those. So that's kind of when we talk affordable housing, it's always, is it on the deed that it's restricted to that unit? And then for the city of Sebastopol, it's 50 units per year, and any that carries over for a couple of years. So it can be for 3 years, actually. So if we only say we issue 10 of those in 1 year, the first year of it, there are 40 kind of permits available that would get added to the next year. So the next year would have 90, and then you take out the number you permit, and you just sort of a carryover kind of a math. So I will say we have never run up against that in the whatever almost 20 years that we've had it. One of the things that does actually kind of apply to you guys, and you should know about, is that the new laws do prohibit more than 5 hearings on any one project. So staff, we will certainly, and I certainly make sure that if we don't feel like a project's ready to come to you, we will tell the applicant that, and try to get them to correct the things that need to be corrected, especially after the first hearing or first and second hearing on a project. So
If they're meeting the objective standards, they don't even come to us. So what meetings would that refer to, or hearings?
correct.
that
And that
refer
is
to?
actually one of the really weird, well, so it does apply to any.
Right. But what would that?
So
be?
so like the First Street project, frankly, met the objective standards. So it met the zoning. So by objective standards, it means like the zoning
Oh, not
standards.
the-
So the
the-
density,
That would
the
work too.
setbacks. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
okay.
It also applies to those projects. I believe it does. However, according to our council, it does not apply to any hearings that were held before this went into effect in 2022, I think. So if someone's just been hanging out for a long time, like Huntley Square took years and years and years, yeah, you don't have to go back to 2015 when their original preliminary hearing was. You just look at the last, it's considered a new project after it hasn't been around for 6 months. So. And that is actually a part of this law that's really important, is that when you do your preliminary review, if you wait more than 6 months, you lose all of this stuff and it's considered a new project again. So you don't get to, as a developer, do a preliminary review with a really crap project that isn't ready, just to get under the wire for something and then not submit for 3 years' time. That would reset and it'd be considered a new project. It does restrict the demolition of existing residential units in some cases, but it's really more which laws can utilize provisions of this. So like, for instance, to be eligible for SB 35, you cannot be demolishing tenant housing, rental occupied housing. Those were both 2 single family homes that were owner occupied, so it did not apply to that. And we did a thorough investigation on that because we got concerns about that from the community. All right.
Carrie,
So
can you comment on
Sure.
that sunset date that was noted there?
yes. When this law was originally adopted, and it is currently set to sunset, to be effective it was called the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. It was passed with the assumption it would sunset at the end of 2024. There is, however, state legislation the state legislator could extend it at any time, but there is a proposal, I believe by Senator Wiener, to eliminate the sunset and just have it be a permanent requirement. And I believe that's in this year's set of housing laws. I'm not sure exactly where all that stuff is at this point. And the same actually applied to SB 35, and that's also there's a proposal to do the same thing where it would not have a sunset date. So I do want to spend a little time on SB 35 because that is what these objective standards would apply to. So just so you understand what's going on with it. It does allow for streamlined ministerial approvals. And I will say the way the law was written was really weird because it does say you could potentially have a hearing. And I've talked with our city attorney and city manager and said, how do we have a public hearing when it's not discretionary? And that would put the DRB or whoever is making that decision in an incredibly weird, uncomfortable position. So what we have done with the city is, and what we did with the Woodmark project, to be just open and completely transparent, is we published the incompleteness letter and our decisions. And under our own code, any administrative decision, which is, staff's decision, is this project consistent or not? Should this be approved or not? Is subject to an appeal by either the applicant or a member of the public. And so we did that within all of the timeframe lines of SB 35. So we were still doing it at that ministerial level, but if someone from the public felt we had made an error, or the developer applicant felt we had made an error, they had that course and they could have challenged our decision. So that is how we've chosen to, how I recommend, and how myself and the city manager have chosen to handle that. Because it would just, in my mind, be super confusing to have a public hearing where you guys do not have discretion over whether you say approve a project or not. And we can talk about that if you aren't comfortable with that, but it's a weird law. I don't believe most cities are doing any sort of public hearing. You're not required to, and if a ministerial decision inherently is a yes or no question. The second part of this is interesting. It applies to cities that have not met their regional housing needs allocation for affordable units by income category. And what that means is, let me see, it's been a while since I've done this. Okay, I didn't put that for the last part of our last housing cycle. So a housing cycle is every 8 years. We do a housing element. We get a target from ABAG, from HCD through ABAG, of number of houses. It's often called a housing target, or RENA. It's a target for very low, moderate, and above moderate, i.e. market rate units, that every jurisdiction is expected to produce within their 8-year housing element timeframe. And what this law says is, if you're not meeting progress, so they kind of checked it at 50%, 4 years into your cycle. Are you done with half of your units? Basically, have you issued building permits? Is what they actually base it on, not approvals. So, like, even though Huntley Square has been approved for 10 units, they haven't pulled building permits, so that doesn't count until then. Have you issued 50% of your permits in each income category, not just, and I don't know if they look at the above market rate, but they definitely look at the low, very low, and moderate, the more affordable stuff. And if you have not, you're subject to SB 35. So we were subject to SB 35.
I have a quick question about this.
Sure.
So the onus is being put on the jurisdiction to produce this housing, but it's also then dependent on people applying for permits for it, right? So
Correct.
how does the jurisdiction deal with that? If nobody applies for a permit, you can't meet the requirements, correct?
It's kind of the conundrum we are in. What this law was designed to do is make sure that cities don't have laws so onerous. It sort of assumes that people want to build housing. You're absolutely right. It assumes that people want to and are capable of building housing, and that you as a city have made it too onerous. And therefore, if you're so onerous that you're not able to meet your targets, the state's going to come in and saying you don't have any more discretion because you aren't doing a good job of letting people through the gate. It does not have any account for economics. It does not have any account for what we had here in Sonoma County, where we had fires and people couldn't get a hold of contractors to build even their ADU, JADU. I mean, I saw this after the fires, that people just couldn't afford to build the units. It does not account for that at all. So,
So where does the number come from? Where do they come up with this number that we're supposed to meet?
That's a very good question. This is a question
They
Christine
should-
asked me last week, so
Well,
I'm
'cause they
ready with
should
this
look
answer.
at history, right? Well, on average, we've approved 5 units, so next year let's go for 7 units or whatever, right?
Right.
How do they come up with it?
Right. So what they do, they don't look So the number starts out with the housing and community development and the Department of Finance demographic units. They assign a really large number, presumably based on demographic analysis. They're actually going through surveys, and if you're interested in getting involved, they have some surveys and some potential methodologies for coming up with that really, really big number. They assign that to regional governments. So our regional government is ABAG, Association of Bay Area Governments. It is 9 counties, 9 counties. Sonoma, Napa, Marin, Contra Costa, Alameda, Santa Clara, San Mateo, San Francisco. Right.
And Alameda, you said, yeah.
Yeah,
it's
and
9
Alameda, yeah.
counties, right?
9, thank you. I couldn't remember if I said
That's
Alameda
right.
or not. Yeah. So they give a really big number, like I forget what it was. It was something like 58,000 units, or I'm sorry, I cannot remember what that number was. It's a really big number. And I'm happy to get that number to you. ABAG in terms, and they do that throughout the state. So like, and they have different cycles. So they're not doing it all at once, and everyone is doing it all at once. Like San Diego is like on a 4-year off. Southern California is on like a 4-year offset from us. So they're about to get their next, in a couple of years, they'll be getting their next big RENA number and working through their process. So it is staggered around the state. SACOG, Sacramento Association of Governments, they have, Sacramento, Yolo, Solano, Placer, that kind of thing. So everyone, that's how the state works. They handle that number. The regional government, and this is where I'm assuming it's the same for everyone, but I'll talk about what ABAG does. They put together a methodology committee that includes both political and staff representatives from each county. And it's not necessarily each city, it's each county to sit on a methodology committee not to distribute the numbers, but to come up with a methodology for distribution. What are the factors they should account for? Things like equity, should they count progress or deficit of what you've been doing to date? So that, we were able to do 5 last year, so we'll try to do 7 this year. Well, that doesn't help for the people who just really aren't opening that gate at all, right? And I actually worked for the city of Oakland before SB 35 and a bunch of these more, I'll call them stick laws as opposed to the carrot laws were enacted. And Oakland was always really frustrated because they're like, yeah, we're not meeting our RENA, but we're so much closer than anyone else is. And we just keep getting bigger and bigger numbers, right? It's, you don't want to punish people who are trying their best. They looked at environmental factors, capacity, greenhouse gas emissions. They went through all sorts of charts and how they should weight things. Our representative was the Cotati development director, and someone from actually Jane Riley, who ended up being our consultant when she worked for the county as their deputy, their housing lead there. So we were actually one of the only places that had a kind of co-leaders, because our planning director group is really super collaborative. And we had a lot of meetings with that group after and before each of those meetings. So I totally had input into this and understanding what was going on, even though I wasn't involved directly. And then I just believe Susan Adams Cullingworth was the political appointee to it, on the politics side of that. So they came up with a methodology without actually looking at any of the numbers, but just what that should look like. They then ran a bunch of scenarios to kind of test it out and see and make sure it was going to be some sort of equitable thing. And once the ABAG board had approved that methodology, they went through and they did the growth modeling and all the inputs, came out with draft allocations. So Bastable's draft allocation was originally 413 units. I said, holy cow, that's a lot. Our current, the cycle that just ended in December, or actually January 31st of this year, was 120 units by comparison. So it's 4 times as big. And I look at us, that's more than 10% of our housing stock. We have like 3,400 or so, 3,400 or so housing units right now. So I kind of look at it as a percentage. Yeah. You know, if you're from a bigger community, you're going to look at 400 and go, yeah, what's your problem, Sebastopol? That's more than 10% of my entire housing stock. I did have a bunch of meetings with ABEG, not to just argue the member, but to understand the methodology of how they, what modeling thing they were doing. And it turns out they actually had a lot of areas in floodplains and in industrial areas, because we have a conditional use permit where you can allow housing at 29 units per acre. They assumed we would allow 29 units per acre of housing in all of those areas. And I actually showed pictures of the 2019 flood, and like, no, you're not going to put housing on the east side of Morris Street because it's going to be flooded. And that's not consistent with our general plan and all these other things. And so, you know, we went through a lot of discussions. They went through they made some of those adjustments, and then they also went through their CEQA process, because it did require an EIR, and looked at greenhouse gases and things like that. And they also looked at equity and, you know, hazards and all that kind of stuff. They ended up adjusting our number down to 213, which I think is reasonable and doable. And we did our housing element, and we can certainly accommodate that within, like the Woodmark project is 48 units. We have the 80 unit City Ventures proposal that we're processing right now. So, you know, we've got things, and I think we will be able to do a really good job on that. The other thing, just to bring us, any questions on RENA before I move on? Because that's a super confusing, and if I had known I was going to ask that question, I should have had some slides for that, but I don't.
I have a question, but first of all, thank God we had you.
It's a big job, but it
yeah.
was important. It
So
really was.
when they're designating all these units, how are they taking into account each jurisdiction's ability to deal with infrastructure, such as sewer, electric, schools, fire, policing?
So they aren't necessarily responsible for that. Although I did certainly have discussions about the fact that like the sphere of influence on the south side of town, that's a huge infrastructure barrier. And I actually had conversations with them along with Jane Riley when she was at the county, because they had similar, I mean, the Sonoma County's RENA is 5,000-ish or more. And that's just an unincorporated area. So some of that will be Roseland, where they are planning on annexing it and all that kind of stuff, and some of the areas, but 5,000 units in the county is going to be a huge lift for them. I will say that
Just
right
to
now.
clarify, this does not include the city jurisdictions. This is the county.
Just unincorporated Sonoma County. Yeah. So it does include places like Sonoma Valley where they do have some planned stuff. The whole, I forget what that Springs plan, I think it is called. I'm not as familiar with that, but I know they are been working on that. So Jane and I actually met together because, you know, West County and Sebastopol are all kind of, we're going to have the same infrastructure problems, frankly, if you know, it's because we know a lot of West County comes right through Sebastopol. And our roads are very limited. So yeah, so does that answer that? I'm sorry if did I answer the question?
Sort of. I'm just
So-
curious about the impact on infrastructure, because what I see around me is infrastructure failing everywhere.
Right.
So now we're going to put a new imposition on infrastructure with all these units that are just decided through this committee.
Right.
And-
So
and-
that is one of the primary things that a city is responsible for, is planning and providing infrastructure. So like for the city of Sebastopol, I will say we have aging stormwater, sewer, and water master plans. Those do need to be updated. Engineering knows that, and I'm sure we'll work through that in the next few years. Once you have, and you know, with the fresh general plan that was adopted in 2016, that was a wonderful thing as a planning director to come to. I've gone to places and it's been like 20 years old, and you're like, oh, great, this is completely out of date. First thing you have to do is a major visioning. That outlines potential growth. I mean, our general plan, that's what it does. It says, here's what we're anticipating for growth for build out through 2035. Here's the numbers. And here's the ideas we have for accommodating that. So what a city does with that is we go, okay, well, we're looking at potentially 3 intersections there. We need improvements there. We need to widen that. We need to add that road. Here's this list of infrastructure projects. And I'm just going to use for traffic because the traffic plan is kind of in the general plan. What's that going to cost? And then you figure out how to apply that as a development impact fee to new development for the expansion of that infrastructure. Development impact fees do not, and you cannot apply them to existing infrastructure, maintenance of existing infrastructure. That's the responsibility of how you tax your citizens and how you do that. The only thing a development, i.e. you're coming in and you're creating more traffic, more demand for water, more demand for sewer, et cetera, more demand for government facilities and fire and all of those, is a charge to expand the capacity you would need to accommodate that infrastructure. And that includes the parks well. So we did do a development impact fee study based on that in 2021 or 2020, and we adopted that in 2021 for the next 5 years, 6 years of development. And it did change our structure kind of significantly, particularly for single family homes. The multifamily changed a bit but overall the impact fee per unit was fairly consistent, and that's kind of looking at, well, water is more efficient for multifamily, because you don't have, a huge yard and usually nearly as many bedrooms and all that kind of stuff in a single family compared to a multifamily. It is more efficient on roads, right? You're not as dispersed and spread out. So the same number of trips, but it's more efficient. And so, that's what that development impact study looks like. It's on our website, on the planning department website, if you want to go through that. And yeah, it did change some stuff. So, and we also had some fees that we aren't collecting anymore, but there's a wastewater retrofit fee. We are sunsetting that. But we do have some new fees that were introduced. One was the stormwater impact fee. And I kind of recall sharing that with you guys, but we did, the planning commission reviewed this. That's policy wise, that's part of their responsibility, but we set the stormwater impact fee on the basis of square footage of impervious surface, because we want to be able to reward good design that keeps pervious surface. And someone who just wants to pave an entire site, we don't want to reward that. So we want it to be in line with, for that particular one, it was like, how do we do that? I don't want to just do it by lot because it doesn't encourage good design. I want to do it based on design. So let's do it based on the square foot. I feel very strongly about that. So that's how we did that one. And then we also added a fire facility fee and a general government fee. And those we did not have before. And obviously with the conversations at City Council, the fire facility is a huge issue, right? With the discussions going on at council of, do we merge with Goldridge or do we stay our own? Either way, there's significant infrastructure requirements and staffing. So that answered that question. Probably more than you wanted to know. Huh?
Yeah, it just created more questions, but
Right.
I'll
They're
withhold.
probably a little off topic and we can go into
I
that.
would like to know what the general government fee that's being assessed to developers is.
That's a good question.
I can look it up on our website if you give me a second.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a balance of encouraging development through the state's trying to encourage development through a less restrictive process.
Correct.
But then are we charging so much money to a developer that,
Right.
they don't want to
Right.
build?
And the city
Exorbitant
can
fees.
Right.
choose, and the city can choose not to pay the full fee or to discount certain developments if they want to. However, the way the development impact fee works, they have to basically make it up through the general fund. So there's no, you can't charge more to the rest of the development to not charge affordable housing, because you'll get, it's just under the state law, developers could sue you and you couldn't do that. Okay, so we have on our fee schedule, on our planning department website. I'm sorry, I'm not showing this. I will show I'll change my screen so you can see. And I'm apologize for the sloppiness of this. I'm ecstatic for getting a new planning technician to be able to resolve some of our website stuff. Okay, so on the planning department website, there is on the sidebar 8 downloadable documents and there's a fee schedule. There are 2 impact fee schedules listed right now, and that's because some people are subject to the one pre-21, some are to post. And by state law, we have to publish all of our fee schedules. Oops, and that one is not online. That's the old one, I think. Yeah, so this is effective 2021. So any housing project and any commercial any housing project that their initial application is after July 21, or any commercial project based on when they pull a building permit. So it's so housing linkage fee that is applied to well, I'm not going to go through these all. We can do that some other time if you'd like. But general government fee for a single family dwelling unit is $3,000, and for a multifamily is $2,000. Is what those are.
I guess my question is, why are we assessing general government fees? What is it covering? What?
Oh,
is
so
the-
what does it cover? It covers things like, okay, if you have, oops, sorry. If you have city hall, police service, fire service, public works services, and you double the size of your community, guess what's going to happen to all those services? They're going to have to expand. Where are you going to put those people? Where are they going to work out of? Those facilities are going to have to expand to accommodate them. That's what that is based on.
Mm.
So like right now, the city council in their discussions on the fire merge, Goldridge has said, yeah, you know, we're happy to have you if you want to come. However, your fire station would need to be expanded significantly to be able to accommodate staffing there. There's no sleeping quarters or anything like that there. It's joint building and fire. It's pretty limited. You're going to have to do an expansion of that facility. There's no money for this. This general government fee would cover that. And the fire facility fee, same thing, that actually applies to, we need another engine, you know, the capital improvements, which do apply to fire engines. I mean, they're that expensive. They consider it a capital improvement that depreciates over time.
Yeah.
So that's what those fees are used for.
Great, thank you.
And they actually can be utilized for library expansions as well. And I know we do have Sonoma County Library is recommended to expand our library significantly, more than double, I think. But there's no money for that. Well, this is something that could be used towards that. Any other question on the development impact fees while I get us back to the housing law stuff? All right. Okay, so the good news, because it's time for some good news, right? We met our RENA target in the very low, in all the categories we needed to not be subject to SB 35 starting in June when they make that determination. So again, I said they reassess it. They assess it at the end of your cycle and at the halfway mark. So we will not be subject. We had 120 units. We built at the end of 20, what year is it? It's 23. At the end of December, as of December 21, we had done 213 units. Sorry, 123 units. So we had done 3 units more. We didn't quite have the categories right. However, and I think we did I forget what it is because John did that report, but it was somewhere between 6 or 8 ADUs and 1 single family home in this last year. So we did a total of about 130 units in the last 8 years. And so we have an excess, and this does include the Elderberry Commons, 31 units that the county did. It's in our jurisdiction. So even though that was their project, it's in our jurisdiction, it counts for us. And so I did count that. I had the choice of counting it in the last cycle or the new cycle. I counted in the last cycle so we could meet our RENA numbers. And knowing that Woodmark was be in this cycle, and that will allow us to meet our very low numbers for this cycle. If they do their full build out, the whole 84 units. So we do have excess, like if you have excess in the very low, you can account some of those towards the next category up. It's like the low. So I think we were like -2 on the low and minus a few on the above market. but we can use the lower levels, as long as you make but it's more affordable. What you can't do is say, oh, all we did was market rate housing and still be considered consistent with RENA. That's it, but you can do it the other way around. So that's the good news. So we do have these objective design standards we're working on. We have a little bit more breathing room because we won't have projects subject to this SB 35 stuff for at least a few years. And if the way things go, we may not be. We will certainly be subject to the SB 9 legislation, the single family lot split, which is already in effect. So that's the good news.
Sorry, you're saying that no matter what project comes to the city, if it's like a Woodmark type project, it'll go through the typical discretionary review process because we've met these goals.
Because we've met our RENA process. Now, remember, it's in the state right now that SB 35 be a permanent law and not sunset in 2025, which is probably likely to happen. I don't know, but if I was a betting woman, I'd bet that it's probably a pretty easy thing for the legislator to do compared to a new law. It's always easier to extend an existing law than to do a new law. So as of now, so there's two requirements to not be subject to SB 35. One is that you meet those RENA targets or the proportion thereof. And the second is that you submit you do your annual reporting to the state, which Sebastopol has always done. So.
Curious if you're seeing applications year to date for 2023 slowing down compared to prior years.
I would say no.
Really? So,
well, I mean,
economics aside, projects are moving forward.
Correct. So we did get the official, the 80 units from City Ventures. That's a market rate with inclusionary housing. So I think it's 15% of the units would be moderate. The rest would be market. They're also designing it as a minimum of 80. Some of their market rate units, I think it's like up to 17 of them, have 3 bedrooms where you have an option of having a 2-bedroom and an ADU. And ADUs count towards a dwelling unit. So there's some flexibility in there for whoever moves into that project. We just started the EIR for that project, environmental impact report. But yeah, that was, they're moving forward with that. So
Awesome.
the Barlow Hotel did withdraw their application. I don't know if that has something to do with economics. I don't, they said their focus was elsewhere right now. But in terms of housing, we have not seen a slowing down. Council did approve the city partnering with St. Vincent de Paul to submit a project home key round 3 for new construction at what's currently the safe parking for RVs, 845 Gravenstein. They will be coming to DRB, but they're actually, and probably 3 of you, maybe 4 of you actually, Lynn, you might have been back when that was originally approved in 2016. I don't know, I wasn't here for that, but there was a mixed use building approved for that. They are basically utilizing the same site plan and layout with the building up front and the parking behind, and modifying it so that it is, instead of, I think it was 10,000 commercial and 11 units above, that it would be 11 units below, 11 units above, so 22. They may also look at potentially adding a 3rd story set on the back part of that, so it's stepped back from all of the sides to get a few more units. They're working out what that would be. It's consistent with the zoning and everything. So that will be coming to you probably in a couple months' time, I would guess. I'm meeting with them tomorrow in the state. So that's, that's obviously state funding. So that's not necessarily the same economics as market rate housing. And then of course we did just have the 22 unit preliminary review for the Kathy Austin project, which you saw. So those are all, compared to when I got here in 2018, the only thing on the books was the Barlow townhomes, the 18 units, and then the Huntley Square, which was just approved. So we continue to see people interested in meeting with us about potential projects for other sites as well. So. All right, so I'm not going to go into this detail, but basically you do have to have a certain amount of affordability in your project. You can't be a market rate only project and go through the SB 35 process. And that what levels are like, it's math that is, you could read through the law if you want or ask me later. I'm happy to share this slide deck with you as well if you want to read this. They do have some requirements if it's mixed use. So like say you're doing downtown, you have to have at least 2/3 of the square footage must be residential. You must, the big thing is that you must comply with all objective zoning and design standards. And that's why we're doing this. And we also have our zoning standards, obviously. So like in commercial areas, our zoning says we require commercial on the first floor and residential above. So you can see where that 2/3, 1/3 plays out. There are a number of other components. So to be eligible for SB 35, CEQA does not apply. We as staff have certain timelines for determining if it's consistent or not based on the project size. That's not really something you guys need to worry about too much. But the one thing I will say that isn't in this slideshow that I think is important is is kind of a list of hazards and other requirements that you can't, if you have a property that's like in a floodplain or in has a, oh, there's all sorts of stuff. It has a bunch of hazards on it. Like, I'm not sure if you're in a wildland urban interface, if you can go through it. We don't have any of that in town. It can't have rental housing on it currently. It can't have a registered historic resource and a number of other things like that. That would be kind of your typical, this isn't going to be appropriate to demolish what's there and build housing, or to just shove something in a floodplain or another hazard, environmental hazard area, you know, earthquake zone, Alquest Presto, that kind of stuff. Can't go through this process. CEQA does not apply to SB 35, which does make it attractive. There are other requirements. You have to do all the prevailing wage stuff and that kind of stuff. It does require, and this was actually something they had to fix at the state legislature because they realized it was an oops. They did not originally require tribal consultation, which CEQA is, when you have a project that goes through CEQA, you automatically do that. They do now require that. They changed that the next year to add that in. And that is one of the things that Woodmark did have to go through. And they do have tribal monitoring during their construction. So any questions on SB 35? All right, I'll go through the rest of this or should I just stop here because it's 5 o'clock? I don't know. I lost the chair.
There's one thing that I'm trying to understand, and it just flashed up there on a second, was the density bonus.
Dang, I was hoping to get out of that. No, I'm kidding. That's fine.
Well, because I looked that up after we talked, and it seemed like it applied when the developer was offering to make some sort of improvement to the city. I mean, like, it's like if they were going to widen the road or put in a traffic light or something.
So I'm going to defer to the chair. We can continue this. I mean, this was the SB 35 is the context for why you're getting the document you're getting today. Lars and I talked about the fact that there's not a whole lot to discuss about the document, but I also don't want to leave no time, which I realize now that I have, for discussing any questions you guys have on the document.
Let me just say where I'm going with this, and then we can take it up later.
Okay.
We had this discussion in our last meeting where I was talking about the retaining walls and talking about the sensitivity of slope sites, and couldn't we just maybe just be somewhat restrictive about the retaining walls instead of going into all that detail?
Mm-hmm.
And you had mentioned, or it might have been Tony Perez had mentioned, well, this could affect the density bonus law and throw in all this stuff. And so then I went and looked it up, and it didn't seem like the two things really crossed over with each other. And we can discuss this later, but just so you know, we can have a conversation about it later, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask the chair if a time check.
Time check.
And then the density law does play in, I mean, you were at that conversation too. So if you feel like we should have just a brief outline of that now, or how you want to. I am okay going over time. I have to be here for 6 p.m. planning commission meeting, but I want to respect all of the board members' time.
So we could do it this, and then we could go through this initial existing conditions analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're all okay with that. I want to be cognizant that your meeting ends at 5 and it's 5. And I
I
apologize.
didn't know our meeting ended at 5.
Oh, okay, okay. Okay,
I don't
excellent.
know.
It's,
Does anyone else have places to go, things to do? Lynn does. So then let's just move on to the
okay.
let's bypass this.
Okay, so I will just leave like in 2 sentences. Density bonus law is a state law that if you meet certain affordability, you can increase the number of units. Like I said, we did not see that at Woodmark, and I haven't seen that used very often, although it is being used more. But the other component of it that does kind of affect, I mean, there's all sorts of charts and we can do that. Is that a qualifying project, i.e. they have the affordable housing, is entitled up to 3 incentives. And they're sometimes called concessions. There's sometimes called incentives. And that's basically saying, okay, here's your objective standards. I can't meet this requirement if they can show that they need that as a concession. They need to waive that setback to be 5 feet instead of 10, or the height of the retaining wall needs to be 9 instead of 8, or the only thing that Woodmark came in as a density bonus concession that they asked for was to overhang the parking into the landscape area. And our code says in our municipal ordinance that can only be approved through the discretionary design review board process. So I asked them to do a density bonus concession because otherwise, I mean, I was like, I don't have the discretion to waive that for you. It's a ministerial process. That's how it works. So they waived it through that. And so this does play into, you can't be the community that just makes your objective standards so onerous that no one can go through it, because people will just use this density bonus law to get around that. So you do need to be reasonable. That's all I wanted to say on
That's
that
good.
piece of it.
Yeah. But I do have one question that came out with the targets that a city's trying to hit. So you had said if we hit those targets, then SB 35 doesn't apply, basically.
Correct.
So
That's the carrot. That's the carrot of, if you're doing a good
Right.
job and you're meeting your targets, then we're not going to make you streamline because your process is working.
so, but is the development recommended
is-
because of projects like Woodmark that could go around the
It is
review?
recommended.
Right. But
I
if
am
we're-
hoping the state doesn't at some point say you can't use your discretionary, you can only use objective.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't introduce discretionary now. So we're lucky that we adopted them previously in 2010, right? Our
Right.
design standards were adopted previously.
Right, but in our case, right now, if we keep meeting our numbers, we
Mhm.
never have to use these objective design standards.
Correct.
But we're spending a lot of time and money developing objective design standards. So is that's just as a fail safe, so to speak, because we don't meet our standards one cycle?
Well, the other thing that it will help, and this is kind of why I went over some of those other things, like that Housing Accountability Act and how onerous are you and what are you asking? It does help us defend if someone is completely ignoring all of this stuff with their development, going through their 5 hearings and then saying, you denied our project. And we think it's valid under the Housing Accountability Act. This will actually help, because there's like, hey, look, we had this whole book of guidance for you. You ignored all of it. You didn't comply with any of these objective standards or zoning standards. You know, they're like, you didn't even look at it and you're not even trying, basically. So it will certainly help us in that kind of a litigation kind of a case.
Thank you.
And yes, I will say when I applied for the grant, and I'm, happy to say this is a state grant applying, doing this, paying for this, it is staff time and the committee's time. And I absolutely appreciate that. I'm hoping, actually, my hope to make sure it's not just something that never has to be used, because it is that there are things in here that may inform adjustments to our discretionary design guidelines, because it's a professional consultant who's helping us. I know there was an effort a few years ago, before I was here, to update design guidelines. and it failed. And so I was like, well, this is one way. I mean, when I was with the city of Mill Valley, I worked on multifamily and mixed use standards. It wasn't objective. It was discretionary. And it was like a year before they passed SB 35. So it kind of drove me crazy, but they didn't have those in place. We developed those. And then we ended up revising the single family design guidelines because of what we learned in that process. And so I'm hoping that this actually helps inform that back and forth as a useful tool.
Playing the devil's advocate here. These objective design standards, however, having reviewed multiple, I see that they're cross-jurisdictionally the same, pretty much exactly. I was reading at the last meeting verbatim from other cities. Does this not assist developers in a way because they can say, I can make this cookie cutter because I know the objective design standards here are all the same, and they just bring you the project and say, met them. And this is just
I
playing the
would say
devil's
the work we're
advocate.
doing now is modifying that. So the consultant has done a lot of modifications based on conversations that we've had. Just so those who aren't as part of this subcommittee, we've been working with them as staff. And yes, there are certainly things that are consistent among their jurisdictions, but the process we're going through right now is making sure that they are customized to meet the needs of Sebastopol. That's the point. And so like I talked with them this morning at a check-in meeting, they're writing up and actually this is something that they're writing up the grading standards. That's not normally a thing when they're working in places like San Francisco or whatever. They're not concerned about grading. We kind of are because of how much are you manipulating, or I call it terraforming because I'm a Star Trek fan, but like how much are you terraforming a site versus working with the natural site? And that relates directly to grading. It relates also directly to the heritage trees. And that's something they don't normally have a deal with either. It is something that I think this group, it would be helpful to get guidance from this group. Woodmark had like 68 trees that they removed. I think 12 to 14 of them were heritage trees. The rest were Doug firs and Monterey pines and things that are on our exempt list, but they were still significant trees. If we so we do have our tree ordinance for property line trees and things like that. So some protection that way, because that would require the other property owner on a property line tree to authorize the application for removal of that or significant impact on them. But I feel like we should have is it 2 trees or 5% of the heritage trees on the site, or some objective standard number that they can take out 1 or 2, but beyond that, they get kicked out of this process and they have to come before you. And so that's actually one of the topics that if you have time to discuss today, I don't need a number, but just to think about and get a sense of that so that we can get it into draft standards. It will be coming back to you for review. So if you think about it more and want to revise that is definitely a section I want to add for our customization to this document.
Okay, carry on.
So I think that's it for the legal stuff. I think that, the other stuff is not relevant to today's conversation. So thank you for the time to present that. And I hope that was helpful. I will say that we are planning on having another one of these housing laws at a joint planning commission city council meeting. I don't think there were a lot of DRB members who attended the last joint meeting. So I would highly encourage you to attend that because it will go over like SB9, the single family lot split. We will make sure, because we're planning on doing that because we have new council members and new planning commissioners, and they're about to start, along with you guys, the review of this document. And then also of the SB9 document they all need to be adopted by council. So
Can I ask about the SB9? Does that apply to folks who have built ADUs in their backyard and now you can split it? Because that was one of the conditions of building ADUs, is that you couldn't split in the future.
correct. For that particular case, that's a good question. It is possible, depending on the standards of how it was laid out and all that kind of stuff. So it is a possibility. if I know some jurisdictions used to have a deed restriction that it couldn't be split and not just a part of their muni code. I don't know if that's handled differently. I mean, there are definitely things that the state has just said, you can't, I don't care if it's in your deed restriction, you can't do racial discrimination. Sorry. Sorry, you can't prohibit solar no matter what, or you can't prohibit ADUs, which a lot of CCNRs did until the state stepped in and said no. So I would want to check with her city attorney on that. And that's actually why I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail, because they helped us prepare this presentation. They have not updated it to include that SB9 stuff. Okay, so with that, I do want to move on and just what's before you today in your packet. What this is, and I won't go through, we're kind of I kind of already described where we are. We're done with the existing conditions, which was the analysis of what is the character of your town in the different zones. And that's mostly what this document is, that's in your packet. It's like the basis of, okay, what's particular about your community? What's the character? But not just what is the character, but what is the character you want? So like if you have a bunch of snout houses, houses with garages that like stick way out, and that's the only thing you see from the street. I'm sorry, I call them snout houses.
Snout house.
I don't mean it to be derogatory. It's just what they sort of look like. They got their nose sticking out, right? But if that's not what you want something that's more of that. They didn't want to just take the existing, and there were definitely pictures in here from their initial analysis of, yeah, that's great, but that's not what we want. Or, hey, look at the street. It doesn't have garages, or a huge setback, but it's a really cute street and we all really like it, kind of a thing. And so we went through that with them. They finalized this as okay, here's the starting point. And then they also did this for the SB9 parts of town and I will say one of the things that we got to is there's kind of like 3 types of lots in the single family zoning. There's the older where they're narrow 50-60 foot lots, and a split down the middle property line is going to be really problematic. You're more likely to get flag lots and then there's the 50s, 60s, 70s development where it's the more suburban ranch style house where it's a pretty wide lot, not as deep, and that's kind of more of a split. And then they also did analyze the what they call them, the irregular lots. And so a lot of those irregular lots aren't actually residential. We went through that with them, but they did kind of go through and say, okay, this isn't a rectangular lot at all. How are we need to know how many and where those are so we could know how we're going to handle those. And so that's what this document is. It's really more of a transmittal to you, but if you do have any questions or discussion, either with me or your subcommittee members, that's what this meeting is for. So background and this.
Thank you for that, Carrie. So yeah, are there any questions or comments from what you see in your packet today, this initial document we've worked on with the consultant? Lynn, do you have a comment?
No, I'm just a little bit blown away by the changes that are going to be happening in this town. Other than that,
How do you
no.
mean? You're saying what, the way this document is, we're going to suddenly have a much different looking town because of this?
It sure sounds like that. Yes.
I'd be curious to hear more about that. I mean, unless someone else has other questions specific to the document, it's an interesting point you're making or question you're raising.
No, I really don't have further comments.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to add to that with just a question. So in the SB9 zone, it says here that the subject to the single family zoning districts that are subject to SB9. which allows up to 2 lots on any single family parcel and up to 2 units per lot. So that's taking an existing lot and potentially making it 4 residential units instead of 1. So what qualifies somebody for an SB9 lot? What qualifies?
So
that?
any single family lot can be split. There are requirements like you need to actually be owner occupied for a certain number of years after you do the split. There are the law is fairly open, but you can limit, and that's why we're working on some of those standards. You can limit, you have to allow at least 2 800 square foot units on those lots. So, but what this essentially says is, when you create a single family lot, each of those lots can have a single family home and an ADU.
Okay, so hypothetically, let's just say you have your lot and the minimum lot is 1,200 square feet. So hypothetically, could you have a 1,200 square foot lot with 2 800 square foot stacked units? Just for example.
Well, if you have an existing,
So you're taking your lot, let's say you have a 5,000 square foot lot.
5,000
Yeah.
square foot is pretty typical in town.
Yeah,
that's
so you're gonna
5,000 to
do,
6,000.
you're gonna comply. So I assume that you would apply with SB9 is if it's just purely zoned residential, it can't be in a zoning that's mixed.
Correct. So
Is that
for
true?
us, we have R2, R3, and R4 are our single family zones. R5 allows both single family and duplex. And I think it's something more than that, but that is considered a multifamily zone. So that's under the objective design standards. Same with the multifamily R6 and R7 and the commercial zones. So that would all need to be multifamily. So SB9 will apply to R2, R3, and R4.
Okay, so let's just say hypothetically, I'm just trying to understand
Sure.
this. You've got a 5,000 square foot lot. So under SB9, if you met all whatever the conditions were, you could hypothetically, let's say, create a 1,200 square foot lot and then accommodate 2 800 square foot units.
There is actually a minimum size, and I believe, is it 1,200? It's somewhere between,
1,200,
it is
yeah.
1,200. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what most people are doing is actually saying that you have to have, if you have a 5,000 square lot, the lot split needs to be proportional. So you can't make a really tiny lot and then do that. You would have to have, if it's a 5,000, it needs to be in some ratio, either 50-50, 2,500 square foot lots each, or you could allow, if you wanted to, a ratio, so you could have a 2,000 and a 3,000.
Now, is this
however
something
you wanna do that.
we can address in our specific objective
Yes.
design standards? Okay.
Yes, however, you would need to waive those if someone can't build the 800 square foot based on your regulations and their lot. And it's not likely to happen. It
Right.
Well, I
it
mean,
isn't
I can
likely
think
to
of a
happen.
hypothetical. You got a huge heritage oak tree in the middle of your 5,000 square foot lot. Right? So we have in our standards that we can't cut that tree down.
So you have to build a tree house then.
There you
We
go.
have to build a tree house. Well, see, we could do-
Easy.
this would be something that I would like to see because my concern about the objective design standards is they're limiting creativity. And I mentioned that before. But if we could start to do more creative things, well, I mean, I'd like to see that.
A tiny house and a tree. Yeah, there you go.
But, okay, so I mean, I'm just trying to understand, what does this and
Yeah, you do have certain setbacks. They are like the 4-foot setbacks.
Yeah,
So
the 4 foot.
that an ADU is allowed to have. But you can say things like, well, if you have an existing house and you're maintaining it, you can't just, which I've seen people do with ADUs, and I understand they're trying to get maximize and everything, but they'll have a big lot and they'll shove something 4 feet against their neighbors, so it's further away from their house. You can in an SB9 say, hey, you need to space that appropriately, crowd yourself and not your neighbors, so to speak. It's like the people who put their pool. I have the last place I worked, people would put their swimming pool equipment right on the property line and bug their neighbors with it instead of them. Whereas in the old days, you'd always have your pump closer to your house, right? It's the neighborly thing to do. So there's definitely stuff by doing those standards that we can do with those. And the state law doesn't really care about any of that. I mean, it doesn't regulate any of that stuff. It's more the minimum lot size and the reality is if you can't do that, you can still do a duplex and divide it like a subdivision. I mean, like a condo or a townhome.
So you could basically do a duplex and make your lot line the common wall.
Yeah, you could do like a townhome or a side by side or
Yeah.
a duplex. And that's part of what people are potentially looking at doing. Yeah.
All right, any other comments, questions? It's a lot to digest. I know that. I mean, I think overall, it's, this is it's a huge effort that our consultants are really good, and the goal is to not just, we have a housing issue, right? It's not just to suddenly make Sebastopol something that it's not, to accommodate people who need housing. It's to analyze very carefully what's here, and then how could you fit in more housing in a way that's complementary, in each neighborhood, in each zone. The downtown is going to be different than, the outer neighborhood. So I think all in all, it's gonna, to your point, Lynn, yeah, it could change, it could densify, but the goal is not to suddenly have it be, I don't know, an East Bay community or some, bigger city. It's still
Yeah.
trying to work very much with what's here.
Yeah, thank you, Lars, for that. One of my professors who actually, I went to school with one of the principals of Off the Coast, called it elegant density, where you don't actually realize that something is thus dense, it has as many units as it is. So like, and I always get into this, like, well, there's density and there's size, the height, bulk, and mass, right? Like you can have one unit that's a monster house, or you can have one Victorian that is split into 4 units. And density does not equal look. And
Right.
so what this is trying to do is saying, hey, and it is kind of form-based code kind of stuff. It's saying, hey, what we can control is what it looks like. We can't control the density. I mean, we just went through that with the law stuff. It is what it is under state law, but we can control what it looks like. And I know, a lot of people have said Woodmark looks like it's designed for flat lot. It probably was. And then it was placed here. And so this is the effort of like, okay, it's not a flat lot and it has this other context. How can the number of units, fine, that's allowed by our city. But how can we get that to look and be more sensitive to the actual location? And that's, to me, the point of these objective standards.
And then you'll get to see more of it as we go along, and what these standards actually are, how they come together, and the architectural character and all of that too. So we'll
And that
continue
will
on.
probably be early fall, it's like September, October, just so everyone kind of knows.
Okay.
And we will not spring, this looked like a huge
Yeah.
document. I will say, A, it's a lot of pictures.
Mhm.
But B, it's also a lot of stuff you probably all know just from living in town. So we will not spring this document on you without, 2 to 3 weeks to sit through and review it. And it'll probably take a couple of meetings to get through it. So not, just.
I'd love to know who's taking the photos and choosing what is representative of a stoop and what isn't representative of a stoop.
Well, that's a very good point. I think we brought that up, like, are flat roofs allowed or shed roofs allowed, or is it all going to be sort of, cute little gable roofs with a certain look? So I would encourage you to take pictures or send us pictures, or it's part of something we can give to the consultant. very
Yes,
much.
and they've actually asked us for that.
Yeah.
So if you have pictures of things you would like to be, and if you're like, hey, I wanted this to replace this picture on this page, even better. It's just like, yeah, I don't like this. I don't think it's appropriate. This is much better.
Right.
Definitely.
And
just
that's starting
email me.
with the existing conditions, and we'll continue to, like, there's, it could look like this from this other town, but it meets those, kind of standards we're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and even at our last meeting, we really said, and I've had conversations with the consultant, like, our design review board doesn't like to regulate style, but they want quality design. And they don't want this to limit good design. Yeah. And again, this is a set. It does, yes, have the slant of the new urbanism for sure. And that's part of what we're having to modify is make sure that it doesn't discourage shed roofs. And I brought up the Exchange Bank as a project that you guys visited and liked. That was approved by you guys, and forward thinking design. That may not be everyone's opinion, but I know it certainly was. Yeah, we don't want to limit. We want to prevent bad design. We don't want to limit good design.
Yeah. Okay, great. Any other last comments, questions?
I'll just say thank you to you two for working through this process. It's a hell of a lot of work, and I imagine it's been spirited.
Arduous and spirited.
Yeah, I'll echo that as well. Mhm.
Process would be, I'm not well versed in this concept of urbanism. And so there was a lot of language I had to get caught up on. for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks, everyone. Any other, that's our last agenda, our only agenda item. So we can adjourn till next time, June 27th at
Yes,
3:30, it says, right here.
At 3:30, yes. And we will definitely have that meeting. So I know there's at least one project to review.
Okay, thank you.